Thank you so much, Anne, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of our team, it's truly my pleasure to welcome you here with us today. I'd like to offer you just a brief overview in terms of who we are as the leadership team, a little bit more information about the Institute itself, and some additional training opportunities that we have for you coming in the next couple of months. Here is a look at our Institute leadership team. The Institute is really a result of a robust partnership between 4 of the state's 11 centers of excellence that you see here, along with our colleagues at the Machinists Institute. And the Institute itself is an immersive and intensive professional development pathway that we created really as in response to our rapidly changing workforce, both locally and nationally. It's meant for our entire workforce system, including Washington's community and technical college system, apprenticeship and K-12 workforce, faculty and leaders. It is a training opportunity that used to happen in person, and we're sure anxious to get back to that. But as you know, over the last year, we had to be flexible. And so we're excited to create a series of virtual webinars to keep the momentum and the learning going. And the Institute is also data and expert driven. We know as the project leadership team that we are not the experts. We don't have all the answers. And so we've been very careful from the beginning to be sure that we have identified and have those experts alongside us, guiding, informing, facilitating. I'd say that we're just excited as the leadership team to have developed the platform that gives us the opportunity to come here together today and do this kind of learning. And the institutes really provide a good foundational understanding of implicit bias. Some have been through some implicit bias trainings, others maybe aren't even familiar with the term. So a good foundational understanding of implicit bias, personal learning and reflection, and we go deeper into that kind of reflection, especially with the in-person sessions. And all of that is designed to get us to identifying strategies and tools and processes to identify and reduce those biases that really affect our everyday decision making, that hinder our successes. And I would also mention that while race has been the foundation from the get-go for our workforce implicit bias institutes, we know that there are other biases. There's other things that we need to talk about. And so we also offer exposure to other things that we'll get to on the next slide. Biases related to gender, LGBTQ, socioeconomic, and others, things that we don't even realize are happening. And so race has been the foundation, as I mentioned, but we're excited to get into some of the other topics and learning as well to make sure that this is a continuous learning process and something that people can look forward to for years to come, hopefully. This is just a look at the webinar series that we have coming over the next few months. As I mentioned, several of you were able to join us for our introduction to implicit bias on February 3rd. Happy to have you here with us today, and then you get a look at what's coming, the different topics that we'll be offering in April, May, and June. It's really our hope to again resume in person as soon as possible. We don't know if that'll be summer or fall or beyond. We'll be ready when that time happens. In the meantime, we're glad to have you along with this webinar series, and look for more information on additional opportunities as soon as we have that ready to go. And my most favorite part is getting to introduce our facilitator to you, Dr. Rita Cameron Wedding. She is a professor of women's studies and ethnic studies at Sacramento State University in California. She is an internationally recognized expert on juvenile justice and implicit bias. She has conducted, gosh, Rita, hundreds, if not thousands of trainings for various organizations all across the world. And we're so proud to have her part of this team. She's been our lead facilitator from the get-go. starting 3 years ago. And so Rita, with that, thank you for being with us again, and I invite you to take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, good morning, everybody. It's as always a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. This is such important work, and I don't think it's ever been more important to me than it is right now in this point of my life and this part of history. So this is I have to say, you met Anne a few minutes ago, and Anne came up with the topic, and the team came up with the topic. But I have to tell you, this topic was really, really challenging, because in the past, when I've done this work, and the team knows this, I've been very strategic about, I'm having these conversations about race, and yet I'm very strategic about how I have these conversations. And I'm strategic about it because I know that well, at least when I'm in groups, when we're sitting in a room together, and I ask the group of people, can you tell me if race is still one of the hardest conversations you can have in society today? I can ask a room of 100, 200, 300 people, and just about everyone will raise their hands and say, yes, it's one of the hardest conversations we can have today. But what's interesting, here we are now in the aftermath of a pandemic, protests, like worldwide racial justice protests, and politics that have basically changed the narrative of the world. I mean, that's where we're sitting right now in this conversation. So I have had to be very thoughtful about how I put this work together, but I have to tell you, despite my anxiety, I'm going to give you the most authentic look at this work that I can provide. And I want, when we're moving through this, I want you to be in touch with your feelings. And if I wish we'll be together again, and I'll be able to say it in the classroom. Our feelings are very important. It's like how we feel, how we react. That affective domain will affect how we hear things. And so if you hear something, for example, I'm going to talk about race in a way that I didn't talk about it prior to the pandemic. I would often avoid saying race out loud because it's such a difficult conversation in our country. Most of the places I've been are not really ready to hear it. But today, I'm going to say it out loud. And when I say these things to you, I want you to get in touch with, how does that feel? Does that feel comfortable? Does that feel uncomfortable? So I'm excited. I hope you are. I wish we could start with music, but not today. But the next time we're in person, we will. All right. So and in terms of the topic, this is the focus of the presentation that I've put together. But I've also, as I've mentioned, come up with a different way of addressing this, and that is to look directly at the role of the pandemics, the protests and politics. And I know we've all been taught not to talk about politics in person, or in public, I should say. And so, though I am not going to go into depth on that, I have to at least address it somewhat. So we'll just all be ready for that. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that education does not protect us from inequality. I mean, that's just the bottom line. It's like when I'm walking through the world and I'm going to stores and stuff, and I'm experiencing microaggressions, or people are looking at me as though I don't belong in that particular store, I don't walk around with something that says, I'm Dr. Cameron Wedding. I just, it's like my race, the color of my skin, my gender, assumptions about social class, all of those things will dictate and influence how people see me. When we're looking at women or Black people or Latinx people in the workforce, what we see is that people, you know, are essential workers, that we can now identify people who are at the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. We've identified them as essential workers because they are right now, particularly at the, you know, at some point during the pandemic, they were essential to my survival. I will say that, as being someone who is one of the most vulnerable groups, I had to be very careful about where I went. And so as a result, I didn't go anyplace. And so being able to have people do that very important work has been very critical. Many of these essential workers are working in hotels and motels and food service and drinking establishments. And so they were the hardest hit because these establishments were shuttered, were closed down. And so what we see now, where in the past we probably had a downturn in manufacturing or construction, and this time we're seeing the downturn in the accommodation, public accommodation industries. Next, please. So again, we're looking at the impact of gender and how gender has really triggered this like exodus of women from the workforce. In September alone, 865 women and 865 women over 20 years of age dropped out of the American workforce compared to 216,000 men. So, and the problem with that, I mean, there are a lot of problems with that, but one concern about that is when you think about all the work that we've done over the years to get women in the workplace, you know, all of the trainings that you've gone to, all of the, you know, classes you've attended that speak to the fact that we need to have more women in the workplace, and, you know, workforce education, workforce development programs that are training women to be in non-traditional occupations, only to now being faced with the great possibility that these women may be at least slow to come back and may possibly not return, you know, depending on what, you know, what the outcome is of this pandemic. Next slide, please. The other thing too we have to think about is the impact of social class. You know, what we've seen is a huge social class disparity. You know, a lot of poor people who live, if you can imagine, sometimes I try to think of this. You know, there are two people in my house and we're both on Zoom calls all day. I'm sure that some of you are experiencing the same thing. If we are in close proximity in terms of the rooms, it's almost like we can't hear because we're both doing our work. What about people who live in apartments? What about people who don't have the money for Wi-Fi? What about our students who don't have transportation? What about, you know, our students who rely on each other for, you know, just to make social connections in the world? So what we've seen is that this, you know, virtual learning is possibly here to stay, or at least for a long time. I know some of the schools are still, even the universities are still debating whether or not they will be able to have in-person classes in the fall. So it's like, it has been a huge hit to our society, and and it's not going to go away overnight. Next, please. So when we look at the disparities in terms of race and social class and gender, we have to think of this within the context of systemic racism. The pandemic didn't cause systemic racism, but it certainly did expose it. Systemic racism is one of the key themes of this presentation because it explains how and why we have become so divided. After the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people were asking the question, what is systemic racism? What is it? And a lot of people, and I'm talking about well-meaning people, were basically saying things like, I don't see systemic racism. I don't see it. I don't notice it. But what I want to say about that is that that is precisely the point. Systemic racism can operate without our conscious awareness. It can be the result of intentional acts or unintentional acts, but it's how we as individuals and institutions apply and create rules and guidelines, standards and procedures in ways that have and create a racist effect. So it's something that we're not supposed to see, because if we saw it, being well-meaning people, being fair people, being people who want to support ideals of social justice, we would not tolerate it. And so when it slips kind of like flies under the radar, then that means that, I can move through my life without even having any accountability or awareness. So the second bullet point here is, though, it is, even though history provides no exact precedents for this pandemic, racism is definitely a through line. In other words, racism is definitely a factor in what we're looking at. And on the eve of the economic collapse, certain preconditions were in place that allow us to know with high confidence that the hardships of this episode will fall most heavily on Black and Latinx people, on Indigenous people, Asian people, and other groups of color. Next, please. So let's take a second. I love this expression, the chickens come home to roost. I think many of us have heard this before. Let's take a second to think about what happened a couple of weeks ago in Texas. I was, it just was overwhelming to me to watch people. And, we think of our country as being almost immune to these kinds of events. It's like, this within the last year, we've seen food lines, we've seen food pantries, we've seen, food insecurities, we've seen people now who are facing evictions. It is like mind-boggling that this is where we are. And I'm sure a lot of countries over the world are experiencing similar things, but when you see it in America, it's hard to fathom. And then a couple of weeks ago in Texas, and I think there are still locations in Texas that are still suffering power outages. So freezing temperatures and the fact that they didn't have utilities, and these things took a huge toll on people. But even these events impacted people disproportionately. So while some people were able to go to their garage and pull out the generator, some people were able to go on vacations to get out of the city or the community that in which they were impacted. Most people who were working class people or poor people had no choice but to figure out how to endure. And again, I want you to think about race and social class as the through line. In other words, these things are persistent. And the question I'm going to ask you is, why are they persistent? Why, despite all of our attempts to add social justice and equity and equality and, diversity and inclusion, why do we still reproduce the same outcomes over and over again? So according to the CEO at the Latino Healthcare Forum, and I think most of us would agree with this, that the chickens have come home to roost. When you don't invest in the whole community equally, then you're going to see disparities when you get into situations like the ones that we've seen, not only in Texas, but overall the situation that we have experienced and endured as a result of the pandemic. Next, please. So how do we account for these persistent examples and circumstances of inequality? They're persistent. I've been doing this work for a long time. I started it 30 years ago. I call my work, cultural competency. We've called it diversity. We've had many different iterations to talk about race, to talk about equality, but we still come back to the same thing. So according to Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, hopefully some of you have had an opportunity to read this book. I highly recommend it. She talks about our race system, the way we do race in America, as a social caste system. And this is her definition. I'm going to read it because it's so important, and I want you to really give it some thought. A caste system, she says, is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry or often immutable traits. That would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste, whose forebears, I think I may have spelled that wrong, designed it. So in other words, we've got this program that seems immutable the way we do race. It's what I'm suggesting, quite frankly and directly, is that race is not an accident in our country. In fact, if you look at the research on race, the research shows us that there is no difference in human beings. We talk about ourselves as being different because that's the way it was set up, as though we are different. But Black people, white people, Asian people, Latinx people, we're all the same. And so when we have the same outcomes and we reproduce the same outcomes over and over and over again, it makes you wonder, if we believe that all people are the same, then why are the conditions of people, why do they keep changing? Why, if we believe the people are the same, then why are their circumstances so different? You have people who are consistently ranked amongst the wealthiest and people who are consistently ranked amongst the most poor people in the country, and they typically stay that way. A caste system uses rigid and often arbitrary boundaries to keep the rank groupings apart. So we're going to talk about some of those artificial boundaries, and one of the most important boundaries that we know are schools and the criminal justice system. And of course, the decisions that we as individuals make will also contribute to this caste system. Next slide, please. Is this who we are?
I was intellectually prepared for something like this to happen. And yet it was shocking to see. Anytime something like this happens, the response you tend to get from your standard politician is, this is a shocking aberration, this is not who we are.
The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are.
The problem with that is that, of course, the events of today represent an America that we know of. It's happening right now in America. It makes us pretend that history can only progress in one direction, that we just sort of have to wait for the tough things to pass and our glorious future will be there to greet us, which blinds us to the fact that we have really put ourselves in a terrible predicament, in large part because of social media. All the big social networks are fundamentally built around inciting emotional engagement, and that can be fear, rage, lust, xenophobia. It could also be humor and nostalgia and those kind of nice things, but it's just easier to make people scared than it is to make them feel warm and fuzzy. These are the only things that the algorithms can measure. They don't know how to measure for truth or civic virtue or the inherent quality of an image or something like that. So they very quickly become this competition to tap into people's basest emotions.
Fake news no more.
What you'll see in the wake of this is what you see in the wake of every high-profile disturbance or tragedy, which is you'll see all the platforms making a few very visible decisions to ban this or that person or this or that account. And that may be good, that may be better than nothing, but they're not changing their fundamental underlying structures. They're not changing their incentive. They're not changing their business model. So it's just window dressing. When you hear someone like Joe Biden trying to call us to our better instincts, trying to paint a more optimistic picture of human nature, I think that there's a lot about that that is defensible. I don't think that the only way to respond to that is to say, no, you're naive, you're whitewashing history. Of course, this is who we are. I think either form of that essentialism and determinism, in a way, is kind of missing the point, or at least is far too reductive. It's actually convenient for people like politicians and social media companies to bandy about kind of half-baked notions of human nature so that they can use those notions of human nature to support whatever they were inclined to do in the first place. You can say, well, I won an election, so I have a national mandate, so that's who we are. Or I run a social media platform, so I want us to be able to express ourselves because that's who we are. It's much harder for someone who's running a social media platform to talk about improving the material and structural and psychological conditions in the lives of their users and how you can make it less likely that those conditions will lead people to fear and destruction and violence and xenophobia and all the rest of it. That's a much tougher, multi-layered problem. It's much easier to say, well, I believe in people and I'm optimistic that they're better than this, right? Because that lets you off the hook. The long arc of history doesn't just bend itself. We have to do the work of bending it.
I love that saying, the long arc of history doesn't just bend itself. We have to do the work of bending it. And I don't know about you, but watching the Capitol riots really did something to me inside. I think it not only was there shock for me, but it was confusion. And I think that might be the case for many people in our country and people across the world who I communicate with. And so I think this is our opportunity to figure out how we get it right. So I want to now turn to the 5 factors that I believe keep the systems of inequality or systemic racism intact. So we're going to talk about these 5 factors. One is implicit bias, stereotypes, colorblindness, microaggressions, and language. So let's start with colorblindness. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, Ricardo. We're going to start with implicit bias. Okay, so implicit bias. We all pretty much know what implicit bias is. It has to do with the attitudes and stereotypes that are outside of our conscious awareness. So this basically means that we all have biases. I think, all of you have probably processed that. I'm sure that most of you have taken the Harvard Implicit Association test. And if not, I would strongly encourage that you do that, just so that you have a chance to really think about what your biases might look like. And think about, when I say think about them, I don't mean just one time. It's like, keep that, as you are moving through life, just think about the decisions that you make and the extent to which your decisions might be informed by your biases or a bias. Next slide, please. So this is a video that's going to give us more information about implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm gonna say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Okay, in this slide, hopefully you were able to identify something in that previous video that helps explain it for you or that gives you more insight. So this slide, it just really speaks to the fact that this, implicit bias is actually a mental response that we have. And what the researchers say is that if scientists could scan our brains, if they were able to put us in an MRI machine, they would see our brain will light up when we experience things like fear, threat, or anxiety. So, for example, if you are afraid of snakes or spiders, or in my case, sometimes dogs, even though I now have dogs, but I can, have this anxiety about dogs, our brains light up. And what the research says is that in the same way, our brains light up when we experience fear, threat, and anxiety caused by other things, our brains can also light up in response to people, in particular, Black people. And we'll talk about why. Next slide, please. So the thing about implicit bias is that we have to understand that a lot of people will say, but I like their food, I like their culture, some of my very, very good friends are Latinx people. But the point is that, like, even when we have a positive attitude about a group, it doesn't mean that we can't have biases about them. So those two things can happen simultaneously. I can enjoy cultures that are, based in like Latin American cultures or cultures from any parts of the world, but that won't stop me from having biases. So for instance, one might have a positive overall attitude towards Blacks and still associate them with dangerousness, or Latinos and still assume that they are undocumented. Next slide, please. So whether we're educators, advisors, administrators, employers who possess genuinely egalitarian values, who identify with a politically liberal agenda, all these things notwithstanding, we can still discriminate in subtle but consequential ways. Next slide, please. Again, so when we look at this, it's like we have to think about where do we get, what is it that causes or what informs the biases that we have? And clearly we know the power of the media, because a lot of the information that we have about groups of people, we get this information over and over and over again. We consistently see images of certain, like women, for example, we consistently see images of women in domestic family contexts, and we consistently see images of men in work or professional contexts. And I can tell you, when I took the Harvard Implicit Association test, that tendency for me to associate women with being in a supportive role, in a domestic role, really rang true, which is kind of bizarre for me because I've always been, a professional in the workplace. I was the chair of women's studies for, 23 years at Sacramento State University. And still I found that I have a tendency to associate women with the domestic sphere and men with leadership roles. Next, please. So I want to continue, I want to have this conversation now about, or focus now about institutions, because when we look at systemic racism, we have to recognize the power, how they get embedded in our many social institutions. And I'm going to start with healthcare, because healthcare is so pivotal and so salient in our minds right now. In 2020, the American Medical Association recognized racism as a serious threat to public health. And I think we've all heard this statement, but it's a reminder to us that in the last bullet point, it says that without systemic and structural level change, health inequities will continue to exist and the overall health of our nation will suffer. Again, I want to say it doesn't mean that all people who are in healthcare are bad. It just means that they too we're all a product of our environment. We're all a product of our environment. And so whatever biases we have learned, we have been taught, we have practiced, are going to show up in our work, regardless of what good intentions we have. Next, please. So I'm not going to play the video, but I want you to just think about this. Some of you may have heard this particular report about the Black physician, Dr. Susan Moore, who was suffering from COVID in the hospital, and she basically had to beg her doctor to treat her, and he kept saying, "No, you're not suffering. You don't need this particular medication or this particular drug." And she insisted that the reason that the doctor was not providing her the proper medical services was because of racism. And on Democracy Now!, they had two Black women physicians talking about this particular incident, this horrific incident, which they likened to the killing of George Floyd, because this woman she knew what was happening to her, and she worked in a hospital as a physician, but she couldn't get the health care. And so the doctors who were on Democracy Now!, they talked about the fact that healthcare, as well as our criminal justice system or our law enforcement system, has a way of policing Black people and Black bodies in ways that other groups may not experience or may not be aware of. So the structural racism is an undergirding of both of these systems. Next, please. And that's an image of Dr. Moore. Next, please. So in this one, I want to talk again more about media, about healthcare, and how these systems show up. What we've seen is this explosion of anti-Asian assaults in our society, and this has happened as a result of the way that the media has covered the coronavirus. I think just the fact that it originated in China, and when we can go to the next slide, please. It originated in China, and as a result of that, calling it the China flu, we knew that was going to have a devastating impact on people, but we still referred to it as the Asian flu, the Chinese flu. And as a result of that, a lot of people have been harmed. Next slide, please. In one situation, a woman talked about the fact that her family has endured multiple verbal anti-Asian attacks. And in this case, it was in their family's case, it was fatal. And there have been over 3,000 attacks nationwide against Asians since the pandemic began. Next slide, please. This is a video from CNN about the systemic racism or discrimination against Asian Americans.
Hate crimes against Asian Americans spiking since the pandemic began a year ago. Nearly 3,000 incidents reported. During his testimony on Capitol Hill today, the FBI Director Christopher Wray telling lawmakers the Bureau is concerned about the rise in crimes against Asian Americans. CNN's Amara Walker has that story and a warning for you. Some of the video you're about to see is graphic.
He slashed me from cheek to cheek with a box cutter.
Noel Quintana was attacked on a packed subway in New York last month at the height of the morning rush hour.
There's really a lot of blood oozing. So I was so afraid.
Afraid he would die on his way to work after encountering this man, identified here by New York police. Quintana, a Filipino American, says the stranger repeatedly kicked his tote bag. And when he confronted him about it, the 61-year-old says he was viciously assaulted.
So I asked for help, but nobody came for help.
Quintana believes he may have been targeted because of his race.
Because of the COVID-19, I think there are more Asians being attacked.
According to Stop AAPI Hate, which tracks these kinds of attacks, there have been nearly 3,000 incidents against Asians reported across all 50 states since March last year. The Asian advocacy group says nearly all of them were unprovoked. Though rights groups don't know the exact cause of the surge, they say a clear pattern of targeted hate has emerged since the pandemic began.
They told me to go back to China.
In Los Angeles, 27-year-old Denny Kim says he was punched in the face by two strangers. The LAPD investigating the case as a hate crime. On Thursday, police say a 36-year-old Asian man who was stabbed from behind in New York's Chinatown is now in critical condition. Although the NYPD said the suspect would be charged with a hate crime, no such charges have been filed.
This was driven by hate.
In San Francisco, authorities say an 84-year-old immigrant from Thailand died after being violently shoved to the ground in January. A 19-year-old man facing murder and elder abuse charges.
It's been heartbreaking and devastating for me and so many Asian Americans.
Andrew Yang, New York City Democratic mayoral hopeful, tells CNN that while former President Donald Trump's rhetoric may have fanned the flames of anti-Asian sentiment,
Kung flu,
racism against Asians is nothing new.
Certainly having the President of the United States saying things like Kung flu and China virus did normalize.
That one now, please? Great, thank you. I think I'm sure that you see the picture of this and how impactful it is, not only to that group of people, but just to our country in general. So I want to talk a little bit about the protests. And so this is a protest that was actually in England, but I chose this image because I love it. I love, seeing this gentleman. This is obviously a Black man, and he picked up this white protester and put him on his back because he felt like the white protester was in danger. And so, once again, it doesn't mean that we have to, this is an opportunity, as I was saying before, that can bring us together and not tear us apart. One of the things before I go to the next slide that I also want to mention is that, with the pandemic, we have seen so many people having to make this very important decision about the vaccine. And the vaccine is very important. And with some communities, it's harder than others. And when I was showing you the image or speaking to you about the doctor who died from COVID, and I'm sure you've heard reports about vaccine hesitancy, particularly amongst African-American people. I just think it's important for me to point out that it's because of how that doctor was treated. And not only that, the history of discrimination against groups of people, particularly when you think about the Tuskegee experiment, the syphilis experiment, where they were experimenting on Black men. And there are other similar situations in which Black people have been used as, for experimentation purposes, medical experimentation. So it's really hard to build trust. So when I see images like this, I'm hopeful that all is not lost. Next, please. Again, when we look at institutions, we're thinking about not only the medical situation, systems and medical care facilities, hospitals, etc. We're also thinking about the criminal justice system. And I always show this particular slide because I think it's so important to talk about. In our society, we know that the criminal justice system is probably one of the most significant institutions in terms of its potential impact on the lives of people. And oftentimes we think that things are the same. In fact, my students will often say, well, they do the crime, they pay the time, or however that saying goes, but we don't all pay the time the same way. When we look at the new Jim Crow, in fact, what Michelle Alexander is saying here is that when we looked at the way that we applied laws and enforced laws, like drug laws, it's like crack versus cocaine. What we saw was that, in the beginning, there was a 1:100 ratio for the sentencing for crack versus cocaine. So in other words, you had to have 100 times the amount of cocaine than crack to get the same sentence, which means that if you're using crack, which is a cheaper drug, you're more likely to go to jail for a long time. You could have 100 times that amount of cocaine, which was more likely to be used by people who had resources, much less likely to serve that kind of time. So Michelle Alexander says it's not just about the sentencing. It's about being branded a felon, and that being branded a felon, which restricts your opportunities for, working in the future, for your freedom, for voting, for, housing, for funding for schools or student loans. That's a lifetime label. And what Michelle Alexander says is it's very similar to what happened to people in the original Jim Crow system. Next, please. So in this slide, I'm just going to have you look at the words here. I use this slide because I want people to understand that, again, we see not only media itself and how it can perpetuate these ideas and link these ideas about race and behavior. But in this case, it's like it was used for a political campaign. So this political campaign, this war on drugs, which was like clearly about politics, they linked drugs to Black people in such a way, it became such an inextricable relationship that even today, all these years later, when we think of crime, we think of Black people. And when we think of Black people, we think of crime. And the same is true for drugs. And what's interesting is that the evidence is very consistent about the fact that Black people, that all groups of people have drug usage at similar rates. So it's not about someone breaking the law, it's how we penalize them. It's the sentencing, it's the labeling of their being a felon that ultimately matters. Next, please. So this was what I was just saying. It's like when it's this rhetoric, these stereotypes, these images are so powerful that everyone who looks a certain way can look like a criminal. I look like a criminal to some people, or a potential criminal. When I go in the store and people, I'm walking past someone who has a purse and there's this kind of clutching of the purse. And I often tell the story about being in the store and this woman clutched her purse, and of course it makes me really uncomfortable. But it's not just in one similar example, you know, it was a young boy. He was tall, but I think he was probably only about 13 years old. And he had a purse in the cart of his in his grocery cart. I think he was shopping with his mother. And when I walked by the grocery cart, he clutched the purse. He held onto the purse as if there was somebody who was about to take it. He was like physically holding on. And I looked around, there was no one directly that close to him except me. And I just walked by him, and I was curious about why is it that, you know, is he clutching the purse for me? And I was telling my friend, a colleague of mine who I call the All-American Girl. And if you think about the characteristics of the All-American Girl, when we use that term, you know, what comes to your mind? You know, typically people think of someone who is, you know, white, petite, blonde, blue-eyed, cheerleader, happy, that sort of thing. They think of that person. So I was telling Mary, the All-American Girl, this story. And what Mary said was, never in a million years would I have ever thought the boy was clutching the purse for me. She said, never in a million years would I have thought he was clutching the purse for her, which she had thought that. But the point is this, never in a million years would he have ever gotten the impression that he needed to clutch the purse for her. And the difference is how we have been portrayed in the media, how we've been portrayed in textbooks, and how it gets reiterated on television or social media every day. Next, please. And on the next couple of slides, I just want you to just kind of glance at the data, and the bottom piece is what's most important at the very bottom of the slide. So if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. So when we see these disparities, we have to think not in terms of why are they so much worse than other people, or so much worse than white people. They get more time, they are involved in more crime, but you know, are they really? I like that visual because it really shows you, you know, the data just in terms of the, you know, the image that's right there on the screen. Next, please. Yeah, it's crazy when you look at this. You see the gender differences and you see the race differences, and these things have implications. Though the implications include the fact that one study found that prosecutors dismiss only 30% of cases against African American girls, while dismissing 70% against white girls. So these, you know, these outcomes are important and significant and profound in terms of how they impact the lives of people. Just recently, I worked on a racial impact statement for a new law that we have in California. It's called the Racial Justice Act. And the act, you know, basically it just began in the year 2020. And the act is, if there is bias of anyone in the courtroom, whether it's the judge, whether or not it's, you know, one of the attorneys, the prosecutor, public defender, it doesn't matter. You can file a complaint within the context of this Racial Justice Act. And at first, on the surface, when I was looking at the, you know, the account of the public defender who was basically alleging there was racial bias involved, at first I didn't see it. But once we got into it, once we really dug down deep, I mean, so if you have an eye for understanding what implicit bias looks like, particularly with regard to the criminal justice system, it's there, it was obvious. The problem is we are so used to seeing it that we don't notice it. The judge didn't notice it. And one of the fascinating things about that was that the judge said at one point that she didn't want to allow more time for the defense attorney to look at the Facebook postings of the victim, because she said, oh, it'll take, you know, a couple extra days of court time, and we don't have that kind of time. But at the end of the day, the person who was on trial ended up getting 10 years in prison. 10 years. One of the things I was looking up today was the case with Brock Turner, the Stanford, I think it was a swimmer. He was an athlete at Stanford University. I think you remember, several years back now, when he raped a girl, and the now young woman is going to come to our university and talk about, her experience. But what's fascinating about that, when you look at the disparities, the judge basically, I think this guy just served, hardly no time in prison. He could have been sentenced to 14 years. I think he served only 3 months in jail. He could have gotten 14 years. And the judge basically said, yeah, no, because if we do that, it will, a prison sentence would have a severe effect on the life of this young man. But so we were preserving the outcomes for this young man who was a Stanford student, who was a white student, but yet you have, in the case I gave you, and the case that I was describing was like basically petty theft. It was marijuana theft. So, and it wasn't like a bucket of marijuana, it was just marijuana. All right, next, please. Again, we see that they have consequences, and they have gender consequences as well. Next, please. Again, we have the ICE director who basically said, I can tell which migrant children will become gang members by looking into their eyes. How is that possible? But it's like, when we let things like this go, this is what I was saying when I started. When we let comments like this go, it's like, that means that is going to have an accumulative impact on people. It's going to, that means that we're not going to be able to identify all the various places in which these biases are occurring right before our very eyes, and we don't even realize it. Years ago, one of the former secretaries of education, I think his name was William Bennett, he was doing a radio talk show reporting, and he said, because of his viewpoints, his biases, and his, outright racism, actually, he said, and this is a quote, but I do know that it's true that if you wanted to reduce crime, if that were your sole purpose, you could abort every Black baby in this country and your crime rate would go down. Now, that is someone who was the Secretary of Education. Next slide, please. Is the status of white people immutable, unchanging over time, or is it, can you change it, or is it unable to be changed? What Robin DiAngelo says in White Fragility is that being perceived as white carries more than just a mere racial classification. It is a social and institutional status and an identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. Next, please. So patriots, protesters, or insurrectionists. It's like, what is happening here? When I first saw that top video, this was, before the election, it's like, I couldn't believe my eyes. Yesterday, I was talking to someone who works in the courts who's from Michigan. He said, now they're not allowed to bring the assault. They can bring the assault rifles to the Capitol in Michigan. They just have to be concealed. But the point I want to make here is, why is this America? That's just my question about this. And that was, it's just something that I keep thinking about. How did we get here? Next, please. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security put out a report, and the report was that white supremacists were the most persistent and lethal threat in the United States. Media outlets' decisions to frame, create, and classify issues in a specific way can influence perceptions and contribute to the social construction of both race and gender. Next slide, please. So we know how frequent it is for Black people to be described as criminals, and I've talked about this. So you can look at any of these things. Their heightened security or scrutiny for living while Black from random people. Any random person can make a call and just mention that it's a Black person, and you'll get probably 2 or 3 police cars out there. And that's because it's the stereotypes. It's the fact that we have portrayed them as being such a problem in our society. But what I want you to think about is that constructed racism? Is that systemic racism? Is a man bird watching in Central Park? Do we really need to have that kind of scrutiny and police surveillance? This person sitting in a study hall or study lab on a prestigious university campus was, just doing a homework and fell asleep, and they called the police. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? It's like I think one of the ways that we got here, we got into the situation that we're in, is because after the civil rights movement, it's like we decided that we were going to be a colorblind society, and that came from, the positive aspirations of Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, "I dream that one day my 4 children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That was an ideal that I think we all value, but we're not there yet. And so to teach people that they don't have to talk about race, don't think about race because race doesn't matter, all that has done is let us off the hook. It means that we can't talk about it. And those of us who do talk about it, we are the problem worse than racism itself. I think one of the comments that we got in our last webinar is that, maybe if we didn't talk about race, there wouldn't be a problem. But it's just the opposite. By not talking about race and by not being authentic about it, we are just perpetuating problems over and over again. Next, please. So yes, we need to talk about it. Even Judge Harry Blackman knew this, that in order to get beyond racism, we must take account of race. There is no other way. Next, please. Dr. Ibram Kendi goes one step further. He says, it's not enough to not be racist. We need to be an anti-racist. And that's what I am, encouraging all of us to be. That is what I'm encouraging myself to be. So in other words, after I give a training, when people in the audience say, yes, I know I'm biased. I started out 15 years ago with people saying, I'm not biased. I don't even notice race. I started out there to a place where prior to the pandemic, people were saying, yeah, I'm biased. And it was like a good thing that they could acknowledge that they're biased, but we have to go one more step and say, I'm not just not racist, I'm an anti-racist, which means that I'm going to do something intentional to ensure that my decisions are not based on racism and that they're anti-racist decisions. Next, please. So what are microaggressions? So microaggressions are the slights, snubs, insults that we experience every day or can experience every day. It's like modern day version of racism. It's not the lynching, the cross burning, public accommodations like whites only drinking fountains. It's not like that. It's different, but it's still racism. Next, please. And this is a very brief video that we're going to share because we think it really does tell a very important story. I love that video too. Someone noted that they love that video in the chat, and I do too, because I think it does remind us that it's not even those extremely obvious things that we can do. They can be very subtle, but they can have the same effect. It could be a gaze, a glance, a sideways look at someone, which is something that I have caught myself doing. But all of those things can perpetuate disparities and disparate outcomes. So the next couple of slides, I just want to point out, are talking about the education's two-track system. In other words, what happens in K through 12 is going to directly impact what we see in higher education, regardless of the discipline, but also workforce education. So when we have a disciplinary track and an education track, we can see from all the things I've talked about so far, the kids of color, the poor kids are going to go in one track, the wealthy kids will go in another. Next, please. I was working, and this particular slide is basically talking about a study that they did, and the teachers were told to look at, look for the challenging behaviors. They were given eye scan technology, and they were supposed to look for the challenging behaviors. As it turns out, the teachers all selected the Black boys in particular. Their gazes were focused more on the Black kids. It's because of what we've been taught. So as decision makers, we have to remember that if that person looks guilty, if it's your intuition, if it's your sense that it's a bad person, and if it's a person of color involved, you have to ask yourself, is that coming from a stereotype, or is that coming from something real? And in the same way that when we saw the Capitol riots, it's like I was totally caught off guard, because there is no stereotype that has supported people taking over our Capitol like that. There is no stereotype about people who are disproportionately white. There's no stereotype about that, although we do have historical precedent that it didn't look like that, but we've had, historically mobs of white people. We know KKK, all kinds of events in our history, but it doesn't show up in our popular culture, in our media in the same way. So it catches us off guard, and yet the people who are brown skinned Black people we're reminded of this problem. We're reminded of this problem every day. Next, please. Again, this is an example I won't go into, but this is another way that we can create a multiple track racial education system. They were coding the kids according to the color of their skin. This was a classroom, like a third grade classroom, and they were identifying the students according to the color of their skin in association with their abilities. Next, please. And this one I just want to show, I love the image, but this is from Hidden Figures. And these are this is a fictional account of the Black women who were considered the human computers that helped launch the space race, the first space race years ago. So I like that, because again, it reminds us, like, how do we know? Are we missing something? How do we know where our talent is? Who the most qualified people are? We can't use race as an indicator for that. Next, please. When we make the mistake of using race as an indicator, we're making a huge mistake, and we're basically, as I said before, perpetuating the problem. In this case, one of the judges said, every time I visit a prison or a juvenile hall, I'm struck by the numbers, the obscenely disproportionate number of Black inmates that we have here in Michigan. So it's not just Michigan, it's all over the country. We have this disproportionality and disparity. We have more Black kids who are being suspended or expelled from school. So, and thus we are thrusting them into the school to prison pipeline. So we just have to be more mindful of what our biases do and how our decisions will add to this problem. Next, please. So this is what I'm going to do. We're almost at the end. So Ricardo, if you would take us to the last slide, and then I will, yes, the last slide. Okay, great. Oops, sorry. All right. So I just want to say, I mean, I actually had more time than before, but when I have more time, I just add more interesting things that I think you'd want to hear. I'm just going to close with this, and then we have time for Q&A. So this is basically a quote that's from Isabel Wilkerson's book. I don't know if any of you have read the book. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And she's using this metaphor for America. And I think it really is a good way for us to think about America. I'm going to read part of it, and then the rest you'll just see on the slide. She says, "We in the developed world are like homeowners." So she's associating this metaphor to an old house in America. She says, "We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable, loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patch, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even." She says, many people might rightly say, "I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves, and yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. Any further deterioration is in our hands." I thought that was very appropriate for today and for this time in our history. Okay, so we've gotten through most of our slides, and we have time now for a Q&A, and Ricardo is going to facilitate that for us.
Thank you so much, Rita. That was fantastic. One of our attendees asks, and if you'll click the Q&A button on your computer, it's a bit of a longer question, but they asked to hear thoughts or comments on applying the concept of discretion elimination more broadly to address the topics that we're discussing today. And they provided a little bit of a background. Social psychologist Anthony Greenwald of the University of Washington mentioned in a recent interview that making people aware of their implicit biases doesn't usually change minds. The Greenwald interview continues, quote, "Mitigating implicit bias is much harder to do than scientists expected. I think that a lot can be achieved just by collecting data to document disparities that are occurring as a result of bias. And once you know that's happening, the next step is what I call discretion elimination. This can be applied when people are making decisions that involve subjective judgment about a person. Discretion likely results in unintended disparities, but when those decisions are made based on predetermined objective criteria that are rigorously applied, they are much less likely to produce disparities," end quote.
Interesting. I think it is a lot to consider, but I think I know exactly what Dr. Greenwald is referring to. So what I do is I try to be very active in my personal intervention, in my self-reflection. I try to be very actively engaged in other words, I don't just take a class and think I'm done, because sometimes I'm amazed and appalled at my biases and how they show up and how they impact people. And I have often told the story about, going to the 5th floor of my building where my office is. I think it's still there. It's been a while since I've been there with the pandemic, but and there was this young man who was standing there, and he happened to be a Black man. He, you know, there's nothing unusual. He was looking at the bulletin board, but my brain went someplace. My brain went to the same place that all of the stereotypes that I was talking about, where all those stereotypes go. It's like the repetition of seeing Black and criminals, all of that gets like lodged in our brains. And if we don't do something intentional and active and to kind of like intervene on ourselves, I would continue to discriminate against this guy. And what I saw myself doing, I was aware of the fact that he had all of my indicators for bias. He had like dreadlocks. I don't have anything against dreadlocks, but I've been told and taught and by law enforcement, for example, that dreadlocks are an indicator of reasonable suspicion. I mean, it causes law enforcement to kind of look more closely at that person as though they're more likely to commit a crime. He had tattoos. I'm sure many of you have beautiful tattoos. Again, nothing consciously against tattoos. It's just like the combination of these things for my brain, the dreadlocks, the tattoos, and the sagging pants. And he also had a grill. Anyway, all of these things together just kind of did something to my brain. Immediately, I saw myself standing there and just looking like, not like I look at my normal students, or not like I engage with my students normally. I asked them how I can help you, how are you doing? What's your major? None of that engagement was happening. And when I became aware of it, my body language was very like, looking at someone that you distrust. So I caught myself. At some point, I really caught myself. And I had to, and I think this might be what Dr. Greenwald was referring to. I had to have an intervention. I had to use my discretion at that point and ask myself, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And by the way, none of these questions happen out loud. It's just like your mind is working, your mind is trying to change behavior. And my mantra, so the way that I deal with this now is when I encounter something like that, I say to myself, you cannot judge the next best scholar by whether or not they're sagging their pants. And when I do that, I get it. I'm like, you just did that thing. It's like, and once I say that, my body language changes, I'm engaged, I'm moving him through the process of, what he needs to do to sign up for a women's studies class. So I hope that helped.
Can you provide a few tips in speaking to our youngest students or children about race?
Well, I think it's very helpful for kids to be exposed to positive representations of other groups of people, other children who are of different races and genders. It's like, in my family, it's not hard because that next generation is extremely, diverse and multicultural. So the first cousins are all, from different backgrounds, but I think in general through like media programming, books, art, going places where they're exposed to people of color, play dates, playing with people of color. I think all of those things make a difference. And hearing their parents talk about these positive representations, I think can be very effective.
Thank you, Rita. Can you talk more about how we can be anti-racist?
Yeah, I think being anti-racist basically means that I have to be intentional about my racism. I have to be intentional. I have to be able to examine and scrutinize policies and procedures, how I apply them, how, if I allow for them to just kind of pass without me, acknowledging the fact that I made a similar decision, but different outcomes based on race. So in order for me to be an anti-racist, I need to speak up. Today, my intention was to be an anti-racist, which means that I can't have these conversations without naming whiteness. I used to be absolutely mortified about naming whiteness in a group because it was just not allowed. With colorblindness, you're not supposed to talk. You can talk about, people of color. You can talk about at-risk people. You can talk about, people in terms of their, other designations, like their immigration status, all of those things. But for white people, it's like they're just people. And when you name it, the way it was set up, it's like you look like the racist. In fact, in my women's studies classes, when I would name whiteness, people would say, oh, you're white bashing, you're male bashing. And some of you might remember that. So in order for me to be an anti-racist, I have to be intentional about race. I have to be intentional about how I'm upholding racism and systemic racism, and I have to name it. So that's the point. If all of us talk about race, if all of us can just talk about, and not to be political about it, but we need to talk about what happened at the Capitol. We need to talk about it because it has had a profound impact on us, whether we realize it or not. That's my version of being an anti-racist, and it might look different for other people.
Thank you, Rita. We have one final question. Do you have an opinion on eliminating the labels, men, women, African American, Caucasian, etc., we use to describe others, instead calling all a human or a person?
Yes, I do have an opinion about that. I think the whole idea of colorblindness, that concept, it was intended, on the surface, it was intended to kind of like blur the line so that we could all think of ourselves as the same. I think certainly that's the way Dr. Martin Luther King intended it, is that we should all, we're all the same and we should just not talk about people with, in racial terms. But how can we do that as long as we still have a criminal justice system, an educational system, a healthcare system, that all are using race as criteria? It's like, so now is not the time for me to do that, because, in California, we tried to pass a law about 15 years ago. It was called the Racial Privacy Act, which basically meant that no one has to disclose their race or ethnicity. So it was getting to the point where we can just, pretend like, or we can just not use race as an indicator of anything. But at the same time, if we didn't have that data, we would not have known how many people were being locked up, how many kids were being suspended and expelled from school, which group of kids were more likely to graduate from high school or to be in honors programs and move on to, higher, Ivy League colleges or other forms of higher education. We wouldn't know anything about their racial identities. And so as long as we have racial discrimination and systemic racism in our country, we have to talk about race. So I think one time, at some point, that's going to be an ideal, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, I think we might be able to squeeze in one more question. What are your thoughts regarding Black Lives Matter influencing school curriculum based on critical race theory as early as K through 3rd grade? The question goes on to say, teaching children to distrust white people, question?
Well, that wouldn't be my plan. I'm not sure if that's the objective. I'm not sure what that particular curriculum would be. I certainly would not be in agreement of teaching children to distrust white people. I think it's very important that children understand the context of race. I think we talk about race at the dinner table. We have those conversations early on. You know what we've done historically in our country is that we have had an erasure of race. We don't talk about race. We basically pretended like there are no problems, when we have a whole history that really speaks to the problems historically of racism in our country and even today. But we whitewashing that or not talking about that was incredibly problematic. I think that's why many of us had this kind of like crazy backlash, last summer, after the murder of George Floyd. So I think we need to talk about race. And I think that, I think we need to get everybody in on the conversation. But I don't think we should do it from the perspective of teaching people to not trust white people, because I think that's problematic. My ideal is the image that I showed you of, the Black man carrying the white man. It's just something about that image that makes me feel like there's hope.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rita.
The one thing, but I want to say my last words, because it's been a couple of minutes since I said this. I just want everybody to remember, the last line of that quote from Isabel Wilkerson, and just a reminder that any further deterioration is in fact in our hands. I just want to leave you with that.